while those same leftists, those same Islamists of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib will take the side of BDS to strangulate the only free democracy in the Middle East, Israel, and say that they want sanctions against a democratic government with a moral military like the Israeli Defense Force. They'll call them evil. And yet Iran, they don't want to do sanctions. So it's just everything's upside down and no one holds them accountable.
Here today I have President of the American Islamic Forum of Democracy and the co-founder of Muslim Reform Movement, Zuhdi Jasser. Welcome to the Candace Owens Show. So you're a proud Muslim. You're very, very proud of your faith.
Absolutely.
And you're also unapologetically pro-Israel.
Absolutely.
And some people go, whoa, how does that happen? Because we see usually the narrative, especially when you're talking about the Middle East, it seems that all of the blame, they always want to blame Israel, no matter what. The strangest things, anything could happen. It could not rain for 3 days, and it's curse Israel, the Israel state, the IDF. They've brought about all of this. Where does that stem from, and how have you been able to separate yourself from that narrative? And I say narrative because you've been clear that this is not the way actually the majority of Muslims in the West feel, but because we have people that are in power that are using their voice to put this narrative out there, it's become worse and it's become uglier.
So the core of what I'm doing at the American Islamic Forum since we formed in 2003 is to speak truth to power. And the power in our community are the Islamists' establishment, those who believe that we should somehow believe in their interpretation of Islam and their attempt to attack free speech, to attack women's rights, individual rights, ability to criticize them. So top on the list of their power structure is their anti-Semitism, their demonization of the other. And they're, as always with the Jewish community, end up being scapegoats. And if you look globally, the Islamists will use the Jewish community to create and well up, if you will, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic fervor in our community. And Israel is a constant target of that. Now, there's a term I refuse to use, which is Islamophobia, which is a term that the Islamists concocted to prevent criticism of Islam. And when in fact, yes, there might be some bigotry that exists against Muslims, and we can talk about that if you want, but the bottom line is they concocted the term Islamophobia to try to prevent criticism of Islam. And yet they suffer from what I think the Islamists do of Israelophobia, which is—
Never hear that term.
Absolutely. And that's a term really that they should talk about, which is they say, oh, we love Jews, but yet we don't like Israel. And yet BDS is not just a movement of an opinion. BDS is actually a movement to economically destroy the entire state of Israel. So I will tell you, I've testified to Congress a couple times on anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism globally is driven by most of the Muslim majority governments and their ideas. And ultimately, speaking truth to power, there's no doubt that I've visited Israel twice. And both times, and especially in visiting Yad Vashem, I see that they have exhibits of Muslims who were the righteous Muslims that defended and protected Jews during the Holocaust. I wish that was the primary narrative of Muslims during World War II, but the bottom line is the Mufti out of Jerusalem was a Nazi collaborator. There were a lot of issues of Islamic global supremacism that worked with the enemies of Jews globally, but yet there were Muslim patriots that were pro-Western, pro-Israel, pro-Jewish, that were on the side of righteousness. And I think this is the narrative that I don't think you can defeat political Islam without first defeating its anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Because it is as we talk about disease, it is a pathognomonic. In medicine, we talk about pathognomonic signs, which is a key clinical sign. Anti-Semitism is a key clinical sign of Islamists and its intolerance. You see it in the women's movement's leaders of Linda Sarsour and Zahra Balloo and others that were kicked out because, they're so anti-Semitic. How did they not note that?
But isn't it is it not, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong, but I vaguely remember reading months ago that it's actually in Islamic text, like in the Quran, that it is vaguely anti-Semitic. Is there anything about Jewish people in the Quran?
Absolutely. My book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, has a whole chapter about the reinterpretation of passages that if you look at the Saudi primary, the dominant interpretation, the most common passage I say as a Muslim 17 times a day is the opening Fatiha, the opening prayer of the Quran. We say it 17 times a day in our 5 prayers. The Saudi interpretation, that's to the hundreds of millions of books around the world, takes that and says, where we say, follow the path of God, not those who've gone astray, et cetera, The Saudis put in parentheses, not those who've gone astray. Then they put in parentheses, they add like the Jews.
Okay.
And then in
so it
chapter
is.
5, there's in chapter 5 a number of passages that talk about battles against Banu Qurayza and other Jewish tribes. So what do we do with that? We have to embrace a modern interpretation that says, you know what, that might have applied to the 7th century or a battle happening at that time in 623 CE, but it doesn't apply anymore. That if Muhammad was alive today, not what he would do in the 6th century or 7th, but what would he do if he were alive today? I believe in our reform movement, we talk about the fact if Muhammad was alive today, he would embrace the democratic Israel, he would embrace American ideals and reject the Islamic State as a concept, reject jihad as a military concept. So I'm sure people, their heads are exploding saying, oh my God, how can you do that? Granted, this is a minority opinion in our faith community.
Right. Because you're saying rewrite the book, right? So it's like going, if you came to Christians and said, well, you got to just do away and rewrite it, they would say that's not reform. What you're actually introducing is almost a new religion. It's a different.
Yeah, so let me disagree with one thing is that, yes, we're rewriting the interpretations, but the Arabic script, I believe, as in many ways Orthodox, as an Orthodox Sunni Muslim, that I would not alter even a comma to it. But if it says, for example, cut the hands of those who steal, I wouldn't change that passage. Yes, the Saudis sever the hands and are draconian in their laws, but I would say sever can mean take them out of society, put them in prison. So you can do things that are metaphorical adherence to the script, but yet not change the script and just modernize its interpretation. It says, for example, you may marry more than one wife. I've never known a Muslim personally married to more than one wife. Mm-hmm. So what do they do with that passage? You just say, hey, you know what? I ignore it. I'm not going to rip it out, but I'm going to say it just doesn't apply today, and we don't apply it because it shouldn't be applied.
But your parents were Syrian refugees in the 60s, is that correct?
Yeah, my family escaped Syria in the mid-'60s. The Ba'athists, which is sort of the Nazi party of Syria, the Arabists, if you will, took over in 1963. My grandfather, Zuhdi Jasser, was a businessman and an editor, owner of a major newspaper in Syria. And after the French pulled out in 1948, Syria had 20 different coups. Initially, they tried to have democracy, parliamentary government, and it just didn't work because they had really no institutions, no civil society, and it fell apart because the people didn't have a Second Amendment, didn't have a First Amendment, and ultimately the Assad's party, the Ba'athists, took over in 63. Assad took over in 70. The father did. And Syria's been basically the North Korea of the Middle East since then.
So going back to your parents, were they married in Syria?
Yes, they were married in Syria, escaped into Beirut for a year until they waited for the ability to come to America legally.
How did they escape?
They escaped. My father was a graduate from medical school, so he was waiting to get accepted into a medical program internship here in America, and he got accepted to one in Ohio. But even when he got here, he had to talk to his congressman about getting him political asylum in Ohio, and we waited 3 months. I was born a few months after they got here, so I was registered in Syria because they didn't know if they were going to have to go back. And ultimately, they got political asylum from their congressman in the Canton, Ohio area where I was born.
Okay, now why did they seek political asylum?
Because my grandfather was in and out of house arrest. He was, because of his newspaper and work with Free Press for Democracy, was persona non grata, in and out of prison. My father also, after he graduated, refused to serve in the military. While I see America and our military as the most moral fighting force in the world, I will tell you the Middle Eastern militaries, especially the Syrian military, is one of the most evil fighting forces in the world. So he refused to fight for a corrupt fascist military. That's one of the reasons I decided I had to join the U.S. Navy, because I can tell you there are a lot of countries that might have constitutions that look like ours, but without our sons and daughters fighting to protect our freedoms, it's a meaningless piece of paper.
Wow.
And that's one of the reasons. I grew up in Wisconsin, and I wanted to go to medical school, but I also wanted to serve my country. So the Health Profession Scholarship Program gave me the freedom to do both, which is the taxpayers paid for my education, and then I served for 11 years.
That's incredible. So your father declined to fight for his country because he realizes that this is not an environment that he wants to support. He doesn't want to support a fascist regime. And then just one generation later, he has a son who signs up to fight for America, which is incredible. So what does it mean when you said persona non grata. What is the implication there? Because that can just mean like, hey, we don't really like you, right? Because you didn't fight for this country, or you're writing a newspaper that's against what we believe to be true. But it's much more severe to be a persona non grata in a Middle Eastern country. So I just want you to talk about that a little bit.
It's an open-air prison, Candace. It is a regime that 1 out of 9 people in society are part of the mukhabarat, which is the intelligence services. Whether it's Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath or Assad's Ba'ath party, it is a party that takes control of every business. So socialism is not even a question. All companies are owned by the government. Anyone with any means in Syria is working for the government if you have any significant income. The police, the military, the intelligence services are all basically you either hand them your income like the mafia asked for, or you will not exist within a week. Brothers report on brothers, siblings report on others. People are tortured if they don't report what's happening. And in 2011, for the first time in 60 years, the people started to reject that and have mass demonstrations down the streets, children in schools. Just to tell you the horror, little elementary schools, Assad's military people would go into a grade school of 4th graders and ask, do your parents joke about me? Do your parents criticize me? And if the 4th grader would say yes, the police would show up at the parent's house and torture his parents because kids don't lie. So this is the type of society that Syrians wanted to change. And my father embraced Americanism and loyalty to America immediately on stepping off the airplane when he got here, because he realized Syrian nationalism was a failure, that it became a fascist, no different than German nationalism became a failure under Hitler and became an evil ideology. Syrian nationalism under Assad and his son has been an evil ideology. I can't tell you how painful it is. I mean, I see people like Ilhan Omar, who supposedly represents Muslims in America, describe American soldiers in Somalia, where I served. My colleagues, my military colleagues, I was off the shore of Mogadishu in '93 in Operation Restore Hope as a doctor on a ship. And we were there taking food, trying to help resolve the famine there. And yet she tweets in response to Al Franken 2 years ago saying that American military were the biggest terrorists in Somalia in the early 90s when she was only 9 or 10 years old. Zahira Balloo from CARE and a lot of the leftists will say that, oh, American military is similar to ISIS. I mean, that is just craziness. And it is a disrespect for our military. It is a hate for the country that they live in. And I have to tell you, I believe it's intentional. They're so ethnocentrically focused on America and political divides. They will do and say anything to advance their leftist causes. So you see them take the side of Maduro against freedom. You see them take the side of the Khomeinis against those in the streets, the women in the streets that should share their ideas. They take the side of the government because it has political expediency here on the left. And yet on the one hand, they say sanctions kill in Iran, when in fact every Iranian will tell you that what's making the Iranians free today is the strangulation on the power, the maximum pressure policy against the regime there, while those same leftists, those same Islamists of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib will take the side of BDS to strangulate the only free democracy in the Middle East, Israel, and say that they want sanctions against a democratic government with a moral military like the Israeli Defense Force. They'll call them evil. And yet Iran, they don't want to do sanctions. So it's just everything's upside down and no one holds them accountable. I hear a lot of my colleagues in the anti-jihadist movement talking about the Red-Green Alliance. My grandfather in the 60s talked about the Red-Green Alliance. One of the reasons my family is so pro-American is because they started being very, very anti-communist. The Soviets of the 60s and 70s destroyed Syria. Still today, Assad would be long gone had it not been for Russia and Putin and his KGB friends and others. So at the end of the day, the Red-Green Alliance has existed for a long time. What is that? It's the alliance between the socialists globally, socialist communists, the far left, and the green, the Islamists, the theocrats of Khomeinis and the Brotherhood, and Islamic regimes of the OIC all over the planet. That alliance works together with common enemies. So they're collectivists. The socialists are economic collectivists who want to confiscate every dollar you make, and the Islamists are religious identity collectivists who want to confiscate your personal relationship with God.
So you're saying it's a natural alliance.
It's a natural alliance until they get ready to take power.
Then it's
and,
not.
And then they go to war, which is
Right.
what you saw in Syria between the Islamists and the Arabists of Assad, which is what you saw in Iraq between Saddam Hussein and the Islamists of the Khomeinis of the Shia extremists, etc. So until they're almost ready to take power, they work together. Let me tell you one anecdote. In my mosque in Scottsdale, in 2014, we were at the holiday prayer for Ramadan. And the imam stood up and started to talk about how we have enemies in our own community, Islamophobes and bigots that call themselves Muslims, that speak against us on Fox News. And, there's a doctor that does so. And my family's with me at this sermon with 1,000 people from our community in this, and he's sort of going off, didn't say my name, but took me on at the mosque. And, afterwards I was recording the sermon, we posted it, and we said, this is what happens. And he was upset because it was in July 2014 when Hamas was sending in rockets, and I was doing a lot of media saying that Hamas are the warmongers, Hamas are the terrorists, and Israel has to defend itself. So he was very upset as a defender of Palestinian rights. So, I think it shows when you push back and you expose what they do inside our mosques, yes, many people thank the imam for speaking out against this enemy within us, Zuhdi Jasser, but also many, many others came up to me and said, thank you for doing the work you're doing. I'm glad we have a voice. I'm just glad it's not me.
Right. I'm just glad it's not me. So let me ask you a question about jihad. How serious of a problem is it? What is the natural course for somebody who just turns into a jihadist over their lifetime? Like, what is the upbringing? How has this become such a threat?
So, I'll tell you, when I grew up in Wisconsin, there were 3 other Muslim families, and my family built a small mosque, the first one in northeastern Wisconsin. And I learned my scripture, but I didn't really understand what political Islam was until I went to the University of Wisconsin and met some of the Muslim Student Association kids and realized, oh my God, this is a political movement. And I was talking to my mom and dad and like, what I thought Islam was a personal faith with God. What are they talking about? All this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic stuff and Muslim Brotherhood ideas. And slowly I quickly began to avidly read about Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. And then I realized that intertwined to our entire faith identity is the concept of an Islamic State. And with an Islamic State comes an Islamic military. So I realized that in undergrad I said, oh my God, I would never want to serve in an Islamic military. I want to serve in the American military. The only thing I would die for is our Constitution, is our government, is the U.S. government. I would never want to die for Islam. That's God's faith, and I believe in it, but He doesn't want me to give my life for my faith. Yes, I want government under God, but not under Islam or under Christianity. I want it under a constitution under God. So jihad is, you will never defeat jihad. Yes, we've defeated ISIS, we've defeated Al-Qaeda, but it'll keep coming back up until Muslims defeat the Islamic State. Because the Islamic State is the oxygen for jihad. Let's look at Erdogan. Erdogan in Turkey. Turkey's supposedly a democracy. It's part of NATO. I think that should end. I think they have no business being in NATO with Erdogan and his Islamists running that government. But to tell me that when the Turkish military just a few months ago went into Syria, they were posting video of how they went on jihad into Syria, the Turkish military. This wasn't happening 20, 30 years ago under the previous president of Turkey. But now with the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey, they fight wars based on not their state nationalism, but based on global ascendancy of Islamic dominance, of Islamic supremacism. So yes, there's a lot of ideas and discussions of jihad in the Quran, a lot of discussion of jihad in the history of the Prophet, and what we have to do. But I also have friends, close friends, whose first name is jihad. That doesn't mean that their mom wanted to name them Holy War. It is a word that's used in very many different areas in Islam and in the Arabic community. So what we have to do is say, you know what? Once the Islamic State is dead, just as Jefferson ended the Christian state, right? If the West can go from singing Onward Christian Soldiers during the Crusades and now have the only area of the world with democracies, which is an area that created governments that have an establishment clause, We as Muslims, I think, are in that same era. We still have not defeated that. We're 1,440 years old. We still are the sort of in the 15th, 16th century of our faith, and we have to defeat this concept of onward Muslim soldiers. So we might have defeated ISIS, but you're not going to defeat jihad militarily. It has to be done from within, and the idea of wanting to fight for an Islamic State has to end. Fort Hood, for example, with Nidal Hassan. He wore an army uniform. His bio looked frighteningly like mine. And yet he didn't want to die for America. He wanted to die for Islam and for jihad. And that's how you defeat jihad, is by finding Muslims that can be leaders that want to die for America and want to defeat the concept of the Islamic State and its militaries. Until the imams at the mosques in Mecca and Jeddah are starting to talk about the equality of women, changing rules by letting them drive, changing rules by letting them sit on a council in a little puny town in southeastern Saudi Arabia, doesn't change anything other than form window dressing to let the establishment in America feel better. So I think ultimately we have to have a long-term plan, which is to work with reformers, to work on the ground, because I can tell you, if you look at what's happened in 2011, the government's days are numbered, be it the Iranian regime, Saudi Arabia, or whatever. I understand President Trump's recalibration to sort of the Game of Thrones that we had in the 20th century, but the Game of Thrones concept has to end. We have to either be with the people or with their oppressors. And I don't think we're with their oppressors. I just think we sort of have a very short-term approach to sort of a Game of Thrones. The enemy of our enemy is our friend, and sort of the, we don't want al-Qaeda or ISIS to take over Saudi Arabia, so we help the royal family. That sort of, I will tell you, most times we learn that chaos, disruption actually helps clean out systems, helps bring up ultimate treatment of a chronic disease, which is political Islam.
The anti-Semitism that you're seeing pop up in like New York or Philadelphia, they're always in inner cities that are located very close to prisons. I've noticed that, and no one's been talking about that. And I said, people need to go back and look, because Ayan's piece was entitled, the jihadism in prison. Like she literally, and she spelled it out about how it was, and this was years ago, and no one paid attention to it. And now we're sort of seeing the seeds harvest now, I think, a bit.
And I've written about this 7-8 years ago in Counterterrorist magazine about what is the prison problem for the Muslim population? Why do cells actually form in prison? And then we saw in New York a couple cases, and others, they leave prison and then become a cell. Why are they being radicalized there? Well, you have this clinic of radicalization and how it happens, which is related to the imams.
Yeah.
The imams in the prisons. And people say, well, Zuhdi, who would you have as imams? I'm like, our reform movement is not ready to have imams populate the prisons. You need to just stop having all of these imams. They need to be vetted, because if you listen to some of the sermons undercover that have been taped and released, you will hear them calling for jihad. You'll hear them calling for collectivist militancy. And this is not a peaceful sort of spiritual journey the prisoners are making to God. Many of them
operates under the guise that it's, we're going to give them faith and we're going to restore them and they're going to be better people, when in reality, they're converting people to radical forms of radical Islam.
I'll tell you, one of the other obstacles in the African-American community is Louis Farrakhan, is that his Nation of Islam, this guy is a rabid bigot, a rabid fascist anti-Semite who spews some of the most hateful vitriol, and yet Twitter, Facebook platform his hate, will not remove him from those platforms, and yet his ideas are separatist. By definition, Nation of Islam is a separatist movement, and yet you see the relationships he has with the liberation theology folks and others of in the non-Muslim community, and you find that synergy creates an obstacle that's almost impossible to break through for those of us who want to reform. Now, there are some reformers that we're working with that in the African-American community, in Quilliam Foundation in Washington. Muhammad Rahim is working with us closely. So there are folks beginning to work in reform in our reform movement against that. So I would not be taking on this battle if I didn't have a deep, deep love and a personal relationship with God. Now, do I believe that Muslims have the only pathway to God? Absolutely not. That's part of our reform, is doing away with this exclusivity. But for me and for millions of Muslims that are anti-jihad, that are pro-Universal Declaration of Human Rights, pro-equality. We love our faith. We believe that Islam, yes, it means submission, but it can also mean personal submission to God and belief in serving our country, belief in defending everyone's right to agree, to hate our faith, to speak out against it. So we have to do those things. But I will tell you that the greatest assets for America in this battle are going to be God-fearing Muslims. Because, yes, I think people from outside the faith or maybe on the periphery of the faith can point out the problems and the illnesses. But if you're really going to treat the disease, you have to do it with tough love from inside the nucleus, which is what we're trying to do.
And I totally agree with you as someone that's trying to do the same thing for Black America.
It's 2025. America's debt is over $37 trillion, and the dollar just had its worst crash since 1973. That puts your savings and your family's future at risk. That's why we trust Alpha Omega Gold, a company that stands unapologetically with Israel and supports Stand Tall Israel. Visit ao.gold/stand to claim your free precious metals wayfinder guide or call 1-855-426-4653 today. Protect your future before it's too late.